Welcome to Beneath the Surface, a gripping story of transformation and unexpected friendship. Grace Whitman, a wealthy socialite, lives a life of luxury but feels an emptiness she can't quite name. Her world starts to unravel when she begins to notice Samuel, her quiet, steadfast chauffeur, in a new light. As their unlikely bond deepens, Grace is forced to confront her privilege, leading her on a journey of self-discovery and empathy. Will she embrace this change, or will her past pull her back into the superficial life she's always known? Before we dive into Grace's story, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What do you think will happen next? Stay tuned for more stories that explore life's most meaningful transformations. Now, let's begin. Grace Whitman was everything the upper crust of New York society revered. She was always immaculately dressed, with a wardrobe that spoke of effortless luxury. Her every movement was calculated, precise, and full of the quiet confidence that came with old money. Her life was a carousel of exclusive luncheons, charity galas, and elite soirees, where she mingled with people who spoke in whispers about their wealth, but flaunted it with the cars they drove and the homes they lived in. Her mornings were spent being pampered in a gilded penthouse, where an army of staff ensured her every whim was fulfilled. From the moment she awoke, her day was orchestrated. Hairstylists, makeup artists, and personal shoppers rotated in and out of her life, all working to maintain the illusion of perfection. Grace wore it well, but underneath, there was an undercurrent of dissatisfaction she couldn't name. Then there was Samuel Wright, her chauffeur for the past 5 years. Samuel was a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Tall, dignified, with a quiet air of pride that Grace found vaguely irritating. He was everything she wasn't: patient, composed, and seemingly content with his station in life. Grace barely noticed him, except when she needed him to drive her. And even then, it was with a condescending air that spoke volumes about how little she thought of him. On this particular morning, Grace was running late for a high-profile charity luncheon across town. Her manicurist had botched her nails, in her opinion, and she couldn't shake the nagging annoyance that clung to her like the scent of the expensive perfume she wore. Samuel waited by the car, opening the door for her as she stepped out of the building. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't meet his eyes. He was just another piece of her perfectly curated life. The drive was silent, as it always was. Grace, lost in her thoughts about the day ahead, paid no attention to the world outside the tinted windows. Her only focus was the impression she needed to make, who she needed to charm, whose attention she needed to capture. These events were more than just charity. They were battlegrounds for influence, and Grace played the game with calculated precision. But then something jolted her out of her thoughts. The car came to a sudden stop, and Grace's heart leaped in her chest. She looked up, ready to unleash her anger on Samuel, but the words died in her throat. Ahead, a small boy stood frozen in the middle of the street, a ball rolling into the road. Samuel's quick reflexes had stopped the car just in time to avoid what could have been a tragic accident. The boy's wide eyes met Grace's for a moment before he ran off to safety. "Watch where you're going," Grace snapped at Samuel, her voice sharp with irritation. She didn't care about the boy's safety. She cared about the fact that she was now running even later than before. Samuel's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, calm as ever. But there was something there, something Grace couldn't quite place. A flicker of defiance. It was gone before she could dwell on it, and they continued the drive in silence. When they finally arrived at the event, Grace stepped out of the car without a word of thanks, smoothing the fabric of her designer dress as if the incident had never happened. She disappeared into the glittering world of the elite, leaving Samuel behind in the shadow of the grand entrance. The charity luncheon was exactly what Grace had expected. It was held in a breathtaking ballroom, chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors. Waitstaff moved like ghosts between the tables, serving champagne and canapes to a crowd that buzzed with low-cultured conversation. Everyone there was dressed in their finest, and the atmosphere was one of subtle competition who could outshine whom in this glittering display of wealth. Grace played her part flawlessly. She smiled, charmed, and floated through the room as if she belonged there because she did. This was her world, and she had mastered it long ago. But as she made her rounds, exchanging pleasantries with people she barely knew, something felt off. The conversations felt hollow, the praise insincere. The lavish decorations that once awed her seemed gaudy now. She noticed herself drifting into a hollow routine. The same pleasantries, the same smiles. Meanwhile, outside, Samuel waited in the car, his posture straight, eyes forward. For him, this was just another day. He had seen this world from behind the wheel, always on the periphery, but never part of it. While Grace lived in a world of privilege, Samuel's life was one of quiet dignity. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, worked his way through the ranks of various service jobs, and found stability in working for the Whitmans. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a good, honest job. Samuel didn't resent Grace. He didn't resent any of the Whitmans. His mother had raised him to be proud, to never let anyone make him feel small, no matter how much money or power they had. So, he maintained his professionalism, treated Grace with the respect she demanded, and did his job with quiet excellence. He had his own life outside the car, a life Grace would never know or care about. As the luncheon wore on, Grace found herself growing bored. The conversations blurred together, and she felt a sense of detachment from the people around her. At one point, she found herself standing next to a woman who had once been one of her closest friends, but a falling out years ago had left their relationship frosty. The woman's smile was plastic, her compliments laced with hidden barbs, and Grace couldn't help but feel that the world she had built for herself was suddenly very small and very cold. That night, back in the comfort of her penthouse, Grace replayed the day's events in her mind. The luncheon, the people, the endless cycle of empty conversations, it all felt meaningless. But more than anything, she kept coming back to that moment in the car, when Samuel had saved the boy's life. She had barely given it a second thought at the time, more concerned with her own inconvenience than the child's near miss with death. But now, as she sat in front of her vanity, removing her makeup and jewelry, Grace felt an unfamiliar unease creeping in. She had always prided herself on her control, on her ability to command respect, but Samuel's calm in the face of her outburst had shaken her. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her in the rearview mirror calm. Yes, but with something deeper, something she couldn't name. It gnawed at her, unsettled her in a way she wasn't used to. She thought about how she had treated him that day, how she had always treated him. Samuel had been with the Whitman family for years, and she had never once asked him about his life, his family, his thoughts. He was just there, a fixture in her life, like the furniture in her apartment, useful but not worth thinking about. But now, something had shifted. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Samuel than she had ever cared to notice. The idea disturbed her, but it also intrigued her. Who was he, really? What did he think of her? Did he even care? A few days later, Grace found herself sitting in the back of the car once again, heading to yet another event. The city blurred past the windows, a mosaic of high-rises and bustling streets. As they drove through a less affluent neighborhood, Grace glanced out the window and saw a group of children playing on the sidewalk. They were laughing, chasing each other with an infectious joy that seemed completely out of place in the drab surroundings. Grace's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer than usual. She had never spent much time thinking about people like that, people who lived in neighborhoods like these. It was a world so far removed from her own that it might as well have been on another planet. But there was something about the children's laughter that tugged at her, a brief flicker of something she couldn't quite place. She noticed Samuel watching them too, his eyes softening for the briefest of moments. It was a rare glimpse of emotion from him, and it caught her off guard. He almost never let his guard down, always maintaining that same calm, professional demeanor. But now, watching those children, there was a softness to him, a warmth that Grace had never seen before. "Do you have children?" The question slipped out of Grace's mouth before she could stop herself. Samuel hesitated just for a moment before shaking his head. "No, Mom." Grace nodded, unsure of what to say next. The silence that followed wasn't the usual cold, awkward silence she was used to. This was different. It felt human. Over the next few weeks, Grace couldn't shake the small but growing discomfort that lingered whenever she interacted with Samuel. For so long, she had lived in a bubble, her life neatly segmented into categories: family, society friends, staff. Samuel had always been firmly placed in the latter category, and that was how it was meant to be. But now, something had changed, and Grace found herself noticing things about him she had never paid attention to before. It was the small details that unsettled her most: the way Samuel always held the door open for her, how he waited patiently, no matter how unreasonable her demands were, and how he maintained his quiet dignity even in the face of her occasional rudeness. His professionalism was impeccable, and yet Grace sensed a quiet strength beneath it, all a strength that seemed unshaken by her wealth, status, or her dismissive attitude. One evening, after another tedious charity function, Grace found herself sitting in the back of the car as they drove through the city. The neon lights of downtown Manhattan reflected off the car windows, painting her perfectly styled figure in streaks of color. But Grace barely noticed. Instead, she found her gaze drifting to the rearview mirror, where Samuel's steady eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "Samuel," she said, breaking the silence. His eyes flicked to the mirror, meeting hers briefly before returning to the road. "Yes, ma'am." Grace hesitated, unsure of what exactly she wanted to say. "Do you enjoy working for my family?" The question sounded strange even to her, almost absurd in its simplicity. But once it was out, she couldn't take it back. Samuel was quiet for a moment before replying, "It's a good job, Mom. I've been with your family for many years." Grace nodded, but his response left her unsatisfied. It was a polite answer, carefully measured, and it told her nothing about what she really wanted to know. What did he really think of her? Did he resent her condescension? Or had he simply grown used to it? She opened her mouth to ask more but quickly closed it. The walls she had built around herself were too high. She didn't know how to reach across the gap between them, or even if she should. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window as the city passed by in a blur of lights. The following week brought an unusually difficult day for Grace. Her high-end shopping trip had gone terribly wrong. The boutique she frequented didn't have the dress she wanted in her size, and one of the sales clerks had the nerve to suggest she try a different cut. Grace was livid by the time she climbed into the back of the car, her mood as sharp as the winter air outside. As Samuel pulled away from the curb, Grace crossed her arms and glared out the window, fuming. "How hard is it to have a dress ready?" she muttered, more to herself than to Samuel, but her voice carried. "They don't understand the importance of customer service anymore." Samuel said nothing, his focus on navigating the congested city streets. The silence only fueled Grace's frustration. Everything about the day had gone wrong, and now she had to sit in the car with Samuel's quiet, unruffled demeanor adding to her irritation. She wanted him to say something, anything, but he remained as calm and composed as ever. Finally, unable to contain her anger any longer, she snapped. "Samuel, what took you so long to get here today? You're supposed to be on time, not 10 minutes late." Samuel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but his voice remained even. "I apologize, Mom. Traffic was heavier than expected." Grace huffed, crossing her arms tighter across her chest. "Well, you should have planned better. I don't pay you to be late." As soon as the words left her mouth, Grace felt a pang of regret. The irritation bubbling inside her had spilled over, and she'd lashed out at the wrong person. Samuel, who had done nothing but his job with quiet efficiency, was now bearing the brunt of her bad day. They continued in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. As they neared her penthouse, Grace's regret deepened, making her shift uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced at Samuel through the rearview mirror and saw the tension in his jaw. He still hadn't said anything in response to her outburst, but there was a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there before. As they pulled up to her building, Grace felt an unfamiliar tug of guilt. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. "I apologize, Samuel. That was unfair of me." The words surprised both of them. Samuel's eyes briefly met hers in the rearview mirror, and for a moment she saw something soften in his gaze. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, and he gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Mom." Grace stepped out of the car, her heart racing with the realization of what she had just done. She had never apologized to any of her staff before. It felt strange, unsettling even, but as she stood on the sidewalk watching Samuel drive away, she couldn't deny the small sense of relief that followed her words. The next morning, Grace found herself thinking about the apology. She replayed it over and over in her mind, wondering what had compelled her to say it. Was it guilt? Or something deeper? Something she didn't yet understand? Her thoughts drifted to Samuel. Over the years, she had never once taken the time to consider his life beyond the confines of his role as her chauffeur. But lately, she couldn't help but wonder about him. Who was he? Really? What did he do when he wasn't driving her around the city? That evening, after a particularly draining charity event, Grace climbed into the back of the car, exhausted. The night had been a blur of fake smiles and insincere compliments, and all she wanted was to get home and forget about it. As Samuel drove through the quiet streets, Grace found herself studying him in the rearview mirror again. His posture was as straight and composed as ever, his expression unreadable. But something about the way he held himself told her there was more to him than she had ever realized. Without thinking, she broke the silence. "Samuel, do you ever wonder if all of this is worth it?" Samuel glanced at her in the mirror, his eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "Mom." Grace gestured vaguely at the world outside the window, the glittering city that stretched out around them. "This? The parties, the events, the constant need to be seen and admired. Don't you ever wonder if it's all just empty?" Samuel was silent for a moment, considering her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I think it depends on what you value, Mom. Some people find meaning in that world. Others find it elsewhere." Grace felt a strange pang in her chest at his response. She had always thought of her world as the pinnacle of success, the place where everything and everyone revolved around wealth and status. But now, for the first time, she wondered if Samuel was right. Was there something more out there? Something beyond the parties and the money? "Where do you find meaning?" Samuel Grace asked softly. His eyes flicked back to the road, and for a moment, Grace thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, he said, "In my family, Mom. In the people I care about." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. She had never considered family in that way. Her own family was distant, cold, their relationships built on obligation rather than love. But Samuel's words stirred something deep within her, a longing she hadn't realized she had. The rest of the drive was silent, but it wasn't the same oppressive silence they were used to. This time it felt different, more comfortable, more human. Over the following weeks, Grace couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. It was as if Samuel had opened a door to a world she had never seen before, and now that it was open, she couldn't ignore it. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing the small things, the way he smiled when he spoke about his family, the way he held himself with quiet pride even in the face of her previous rudeness. For the first time in her life, Grace felt uncomfortable in her own skin. The life she had built for herself, the world of wealth and status, suddenly felt hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been living a lie, pretending that her money and her influence made her better than the people around her. But how could she change? The thought of stepping outside of her carefully constructed life was terrifying. She had spent years cultivating an image of perfection, and the idea of tearing it all down felt like jumping into an abyss. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, slowly but surely. Grace found herself questioning everything: the events she attended, the people she surrounded herself with, even the way she treated the staff who worked for her. She had always believed that wealth gave her power, but now she wondered if it had also made her blind. One crisp autumn afternoon, Grace was sitting in the back of the car as Samuel drove her home from yet another shopping trip. The air outside was sharp and cool, the trees lining the streets already shedding their leaves. As they passed through a quieter neighborhood, Grace glanced out the window and saw a small park. Children were playing there, laughing and running through the fallen leaves. Their joy was infectious, and for a moment, Grace felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in a long time in V. These children, with their carefree laughter and unfiltered happiness, seemed to have something Grace had lost a long time ago. "Pull over," Grace said suddenly. Samuel hesitated, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror in surprise. "Mom." "Pull over," Grace repeated, more firmly this time. Samuel did as he was told, pulling the car to the side of the street. Grace stepped out of the car, the crisp air biting at her skin as she walked toward the park. She didn't know what had driven her to do this. Perhaps it was the overwhelming sense of restlessness that had been building inside her for weeks. As she stood at the edge of the park, watching the children play, she felt a strange mix of emotions, nostalgia, longing, and a deep sense of unease. She had spent her entire life chasing after things that, in the end, didn't matter. And here, in this simple park, these children were finding joy in something as small as a pile of leaves. For a moment, Grace felt completely out of place. Her designer clothes, perfectly styled hair, and carefully curated life felt absurd in this setting. She was an outsider looking in on a world she didn't understand, world she had never even tried to understand. Samuel remained by the car, watching her from a distance. His expression was unreadable, but Grace knew he was probably wondering what had come over her. She didn't know herself. All she knew was that something inside her had shifted, and she couldn't go back to the way things were. After a few minutes, Grace turned and walked back to the car. She didn't say a word as Samuel opened the door for her, but as she climbed inside, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was beginning to break free from the confines of her life. The drive home was silent, but this time, the silence wasn't oppressive. It felt peaceful. The days following Grace's visit to the park were marked by a sense of internal disquiet she could no longer ignore. The cracks in her perfect, controlled world were deepening, and now it was impossible to pretend that everything was as it had always been. There was an ache inside Hera, longing for something she couldn't quite name, but something real, something deeper than the life she had been living. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just the children in the park, or the emptiness of her high society life that bothered her. It was the knowledge that she had built her entire existence on a foundation of superficiality. Her relationships were shallow, her priorities misplaced, and she had been blind to the humanity of those around her, especially Samuel. Samuel, who had been a constant, quiet presence in her life for years, had never once complained, never asked for anything, never demanded more respect, even when she had treated him as little more than part of the car he drove. And now, Grace couldn't shake the guilt that followed her everywhere. She had seen him differently in the past few weeks, but it wasn't enough. Apologizing once wasn't enough. Something fundamental had to change, and that terrified her. One afternoon, as Samuel drove her to another event this time, a friend's art gallery opening, Grace found herself watching him closely in the rearview mirror again. His face was as calm and composed as ever, but now that she had begun to pay attention, she could see the quiet strength in him, the patience and grace with which he moved through the world. "Samuel," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. He glanced at her in the mirror. "Yes, Mom. Why didn't you ever say anything?" Her voice was shaky, unsure, but the question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Samuel's brows furrowed slightly. "About what, ma'am?" "About the way I've treated you. About everything. You've worked for my family for years, and I've never once thought about how hard it must be for you. You've been so patient, so respectful, even when I wasn't. Why didn't you ever say anything?" Grace's voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability in her tone startling even to her. Samuel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice remained steady. "It wasn't my place, Mom. My job is to do what's asked of me." "That's not what I mean," Grace insisted, frustration mixing with the guilt that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "I've been so blind to everything, to you, to what your life must be like. I never even thought about how you felt. It wasn't fair." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something Grace hadn't heard before. "With respect, Mom, I don't think it's about fairness. Life isn't fair. It's about how we carry ourselves through it. About doing what's right, even when no one is looking." Grace blinked, her throat tightening at his words. There it was again, that quiet strength, that unshakable dignity. She realized then that Samuel had always seen her clearly, even when she hadn't seen herself. He had chosen grace, humility, and integrity over bitterness, and that choice had cost him nothing, while it had gained him everything. The rest of the drive was silent, but Grace's mind was anything but. Samuel's words echoed in her thoughts, and for the first time she saw herself through his eyes, not as the powerful, untouchable woman she had always believed herself to be, but as someone flawed, someone with the ability to grow and change. The breakthrough came a few days later, on a chilly fall morning. Grace had been restless for days, torn between wanting to make amends and not knowing how. Apologizing once didn't feel like enough. She had to do something to show Samuel that she was serious about changing, about treating him with the respect he deserved. But she wasn't sure where to start. Finally, after much internal debate, Grace decided to take a small but meaningful step. That morning, as Samuel pulled up to her building to drive her to yet another function, she asked him something she never had before. "Samuel, would you come inside for a moment? I'd like to speak with you." Samuel looked at her with polite surprise, his usual composure only slightly rattled. "Of course, Mom." They walked into her lavish penthouse, a place Samuel had seen only from the outside until now. Grace led him to the grand sitting room, where sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over the polished marble floors. "Would you like some tea?" Grace asked, her voice quiet but earnest. Samuel hesitated, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. He had always maintained a respectful distance from the personal lives of the people he worked for, and this invitation into her private space felt like a breach of the unspoken boundaries that had existed between them for years. But Grace's expression was open, sincere, and after a brief pause he nodded. "Yes, ma'am, that would be nice." Grace busied herself with preparing the tea, her hands shaking slightly as she poured the hot water into delicate porcelain cups. She had never done something like this before, never made tea for a guest, let alone for someone who worked for her. But as she handed Samuel his cup and sat down across from him, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet stretching between them like a bridge. Grace fidgeted with the edge of her cup, unsure of how to begin. Finally, she looked up and met Samuel's gaze. "Samuel, I owe you a proper apology," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I've treated you unfairly for years, and I didn't realize it until recently. I've taken you for granted, and I've looked down on you in ways I'm ashamed of. I'm sorry." Samuel was silent, his expression unreadable. But there was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, only quiet understanding. "You've always done your job with grace and professionalism, and I've never once acknowledged that," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I've never taken the time to see you as a person, to appreciate the dignity with which you carry yourself. That was wrong of me, and I want to change that. I want to do better." For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. Then slowly he nodded. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot." Grace felt a weight lift from her chest. For so long, she had carried the burden of her own ignorance, her own arrogance, and now, as she sat across from Samuel, she realized that acknowledging it it was the first step toward freeing herself from it. They sat there for a while, sipping tea in companionable silence. It was the first time they had ever truly shared a moment, not as employer and servant, but as two human beings. The barriers that had always existed between them, built by years of unspoken rules and societal expectations, began to fade. As they spoke, Grace learned more about Samuel's life, about his family, his upbringing, his experiences. They shared stories, laughed at small anecdotes, and slowly the divide between them began to close. Grace found herself listening in a way she never had before, not out of obligation or politeness, but out of genuine interest and respect. For the first time, Grace saw Samuel not as her chauffeur, but as a person with a rich inner world, a person who had lived a life full of experiences, challenges, and triumphs. And in that moment, she realized how much she had missed by never bothering to look beyond the surface. By the time Samuel stood to leave, there was a sense of mutual understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that things would be different from now on. Grace walked him to the door, and as she watched him step back into the car, she knew that this was only the beginning of her journey toward becoming a better person. In the weeks that followed, Grace and Samuel's relationship began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Grace made a conscious effort to treat him not just as her chauffeur, but as a person whose thoughts and experiences mattered. She found herself asking about his day, about his family, about the things that made him smile. And in return, Samuel began to open up, sharing small glimpses of his life outside the confines of his job. It wasn't an instant transformation. Years of ingrained habits and societal norms didn't disappear overnight, but Grace was determined to change. She no longer saw Samuel as part of the background, as someone who existed only to serve her needs. He was a person with his own dignity, his own value, and she wanted to honor that. Their conversations became more frequent, and as they spoke, Grace began to see the world through Samuel's eyes. She learned about the struggles he had faced, the quiet resilience with which he had navigated a world that wasn't always kind to him. She saw the pride he took in his work, the respect he showed to everyone around him, regardless of their status or wealth. And in doing so, Grace began to change too. She found herself questioning the way she had always lived her life, the way she had treated people, the way she had valued wealth and status above everything else. She realized how shallow her world had been, how much she had missed by keeping herself isolated in her bubble of privilege. One evening, after attending yet another high society event, Grace found herself sitting in the back of the car, watching the city lights blur past. But this time, something felt different. The glittering world she had once reveled in now seemed distant, almost foreign. "Samuel," she said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you ever wonder what it would be like to live a completely different life? One where none of this," she gestured vaguely at the world outside the window, "matters." Samuel glanced at her in the mirror, his expression thoughtful. "I think we all wonder that at some point, Mom. But I believe it's not about changing the life you have, it's about changing how you live it." Grace considered his words, her chest tightening with the weight of their meaning. She had spent so long chasing after things that in the end didn't really matter. And now, as she sat in the back of the car, she realized that the life she had been living wasn't the one she wanted anymore. It wasn't about abandoning her wealth or status, it was about finding a way to live with integrity, to treat people with kindness and respect, regardless of their position in life. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, from the people who served her champagne at events to the man who had driven her car for years without ever being truly seen. And in that moment, Grace knew that her life was about to change forever. Grace's world was shifting, and though she welcomed the change, she was still learning how to navigate it. Her relationship with Samuel had evolved beyond her expectations, but now she was faced with a more daunting challenge, facing the people from her past, the friends and acquaintances who had once defined her world. As she grew closer to Samuel, Grace couldn't help but feel distant from the life she had once embraced with pride. The superficial conversations, the unspoken competition for status, the obsession with appearances, it all felt hollow now. The real test of Grace's transformation came on the night of a charity gala, one of the biggest social events of the year. It was held in the grand ballroom of a five-star hotel, where the city's elite gathered to show off their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. Grace had attended this gala every year since she could remember, and it was always the same, lavish, extravagant, and filled with people who were more concerned with being seen than with the cause they were supposedly supporting. As she stepped out of the car and into the dazzling lights of the hotel entrance, Grace felt a familiar wave of anxiety wash over her. She had always been good at playing the role of the perfect socialite, But tonight, she wasn't sure she could do it. Samuel's quiet words about living a life of integrity echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she questioned whether she belonged in this world anymore. Samuel, as always, opened the door for her with his usual calm demeanor. But this time, Grace met his eyes and gave him a small, grateful smile, something that had become a silent acknowledgement between them in recent weeks. His steady presence gave her a sense of grounding, and for that, she was thankful. The ballroom was as grand as ever, with crystal chandeliers casting shimmering light over the elegantly dressed crowd. Everywhere she looked, Grace saw familiar faces, people she had known for years, people she had once considered friends. But now, as she moved through the room, exchanging polite greetings and air kisses, she felt a growing sense of detachment. It was as if she were watching it all from a distance, unable to connect with the world she had once been a part of. At one point, Grace found herself standing next to Caroline Prescott, an old friend whose friendship had soured years ago. Caroline was everything Grace used to admire, beautiful, impeccably dressed, and always at the center of attention. But as they exchanged pleasantries, Grace couldn't help but notice the sharpness in Caroline's tone, the barely concealed smugness in her smile. "You've been keeping a low profile lately," Caroline said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I was beginning to wonder if you disappeared from the scene altogether." Grace forced a smile, but inside she felt a flicker of irritation. The old Grace would have responded with a cutting remark of her own, something to put Caroline in her place. But now, she didn't have the energy for the games they used to play. Instead, she simply shrugged. "Just busy with other things," Grace replied, keeping her tone neutral. Caroline's eyes flicked over Grace, as if searching for a weakness to exploit. "I see. Well, it's good to see you out and about again. We were starting to think you'd gone all introspective on us." Grace smiled politely, but the words stung. Caroline's thinly veiled insult was a reminder of the way people in this world operated, always judging, always looking for the smallest flaw to exploit. But instead of rising to the bait, Grace took a deep breath and let it go. She was no longer the person who cared about winning these unspoken battles. As the night wore on, Grace felt increasingly out of place. The shallow conversations, the obsession with wealth and status, it all seemed so trivial now. She found herself thinking about Samuel, about the quiet dignity with which he lived his life. His world was so different from hers, yet it was filled with something hers had always lacked real meaning. At one point during the evening, Grace excused herself from the crowded ballroom and made her way to the terrace. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside, and she took a moment to breathe, to center herself. As she stood there, looking out over the city, she realized that she couldn't go back to the person she had once been. The old Grace, the one who cared only about appearances and status, was gone. In her place was someone who wanted more from life than just wealth and power. And it was Samuel who had helped her see that. A few weeks after the gala, Grace's resolve was tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. Samuel's steady presence in her life had become something she depended on more than she realized. He had become a friend, a confidant, someone who helped her navigate the emotional upheaval of her changing world. But one afternoon, everything shifted when Samuel received an unexpected phone call. Grace was in the back seat of the car, scrolling through her phone, when she noticed Samuel's usual calm demeanor falter. He had answered his phone with his usual professionalism, but the brief conversation that followed left him visibly tense. It was the first time Grace had ever seen him rattled. "What's wrong?" Grace asked, concern coloring her voice. Samuel hesitated, clearly torn between keeping his personal life private and acknowledging her question. After a moment, he sighed and spoke quietly. "It's my family, Mom. My sister's been in an accident. It's serious." Grace felt a surge of empathy. "Do you need to go to her?" Samuel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, clearly conflicted. "Yes, ma'am, but I'm scheduled to drive you for the rest of the day." Grace waved off his concern. "Don't worry about me. Go to your sister. He'll figure something out." Samuel hesitated again, clearly not used to receiving such an offer from someone like Grace. But after a moment he nodded. "Thank you, Mom. Grace watched as Samuel pulled the car over and quickly called a taxi for her before leaving to be with his family. She found herself feeling unexpectedly worried for him. Over the past months, she had come to care about Samuel in a way she never thought possible, not just as an employee, but as a person. She wanted him to be okay, wanted his sister to recover. That evening, after returning home, Grace couldn't stop thinking about Samuel and his family. She realized how little she knew about his personal life, despite all the conversations they had shared recently. It wasn't because Samuel had kept her at a distance, it was because Grace had never thought to ask. She had always assumed that her own problems were more important, more pressing.
But now she saw things differently.
A few days later, Grace decided to reach out to Samuel. She wasn't sure if it was appropriate. After all, she was still his employer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something to help. She called him that afternoon, her voice hesitant. "Samuel, I just wanted to check on you. How's your sister doing?" Samuel's voice, though still professional, held a note of surprise. "She's stable now, ma'am." "Thank you for asking." Grace exhaled, relieved. "I'm glad to hear that. And if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. I mean that." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Grace worried that she had overstepped. But then Samuel spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." When Samuel returned to work a few days later, Grace could sense that something had shifted between them. There was a new level of trust, a deeper understanding that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about the apology she had given him weeks earlier. It was about the small acts of kindness, the moments of genuine concern that had begun to define their relationship. Samuel, who had always been professional and distant, now felt like a true part of her life. And for Grace, that was a revelation. She had spent so long surrounded by people who only cared about her wealth and status. But now she realized that the most important relationships in her life were the ones built on respect, empathy, and kindness. The winter months passed in a blur, and as the holiday season approached, Grace found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. She no longer attended every high society event, no longer cared about keeping up appearances for the sake of her reputation. Instead, she focused on the things that truly mattered, the relationships she had neglected for so long, the people in her life who had shown her what real wealth looked like. Samuel had become more than just her chauffeur. He had become a friend, someone she trusted and respected in a way she had never thought possible. Their relationship, once defined by boundaries of class and privilege, had evolved into something much deeper connection built on mutual understanding and a shared sense of humanity. One snowy afternoon, Grace found herself sitting by the fireplace in her penthouse, sipping tea as she watched the snow fall outside. The world seemed quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in years, Grace felt content. She had spent so much of her life chasing after things that didn't matter, money, power, status, but now she understood that true wealth came from the relationships she built, the kindness she showed, and the empathy she extended to others. That evening, as Samuel drove her to a modest holiday dinner with close friends, Grace felt a sense of gratitude that she had never experienced before. She had always believed that her life was perfect, but now she realized that it had been empty until she had learned to see the people around her truly see them. As they pulled up to the house, Grace turned to Samuel with a smile. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." Samuel's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he smiled a genuine, warm smile that reflected the depth of their newfound friendship. "You're welcome, ma'am." Grace stepped out of the car and into the snowy night, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She knew that the journey she had been on wasn't over, it was only just beginning. But now she was ready to face it with an open heart and a new understanding of what truly mattered. And as she walked into the warm glow of the house, surrounded by the laughter and love of the people who cared about her, Grace knew that she had found something far more valuable than money or status. She had found true wealth in kindness, in empathy, and in the relationships that made life worth living. The new year brought with it a fresh sense of purpose for Grace. She had made a conscious decision to use her wealth and influence for good, to help those who had been overlooked by the world she had once been a part of. Inspired by Samuel's quiet strength and the lessons he had taught her, Grace began working with local charities that supported underserved communities. She didn't do it for the recognition or the accolades, she did it because it was the right thing to do. And as she spent more time helping others, Grace felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. For the first time, her life had real meaning. Samuel, too, remained a constant presence in her life, not just as her chauffeur, but as a trusted friend and confidant. Their bond, once defined by distance and formality, had blossomed into something much more profound, a friendship built on respect, empathy, and shared experiences. As the months passed, Grace continued to grow, to learn, and to evolve. She no longer cared about the trappings of wealth and status. Instead, she focused on the things that truly mattered: kindness, humility, and the relationships that brought her joy. In the end, it was the money or the power that defined Grace. Whitman's life, it was the love and respect she gave and received. And as she looked to the future, she knew that she had finally found the true meaning of wealth. True wealth wasn't in the things she owned, it was in the people whose lives she touched, and in the person she had become. Months had passed since the start of Grace's transformation, and her life was entirely different, simpler, but richer in ways she had never imagined. The changes in her didn't happen overnight, but they were lasting and deep. She no longer lived for the attention and approval of her peers in high society. Instead, her days were filled with real purpose. Grace had shifted her priorities, throwing herself into charitable work with a passion she never knew she had. She began volunteering at shelters, food banks, and educational programs, finding immense fulfillment in helping others who had been dealt a different hand in life. She used her wealth and influence to lift others up, quietly funding initiatives that supported underserved communities, especially those impacted by the kinds of systemic injustices Samuel had faced in his life. Grace no longer saw herself as above anyone else. She had realized that money and status didn't make her better or more important. Her friendship with Samuel had opened her eyes to a world she had never understood, and in that understanding, she found her heart. She felt freer than she ever had before, unburdened by the constant need to impress people who didn't really matter. Samuel had continued to work for her, but their relationship had evolved into something entirely new. He was no longer just her chauffeur, he was a trusted confidant and a cherished friend. Their conversations in the car had shifted from polite small talk to meaningful discussions about life, values, and the things that really mattered. Grace had come to value his wisdom more than she could have ever imagined. One afternoon, after a long day of visiting a youth center she had been helping to fund, Grace sat in the back of the car as Samuel drove her home. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city, and there was a peacefulness in the air. Grace watched the world pass by through the window, feeling a deep sense of contentment. As they stopped at a red light, Grace leaned forward slightly. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about the future." Samuel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression calm as always. "What about it, ma'am?" Grace smiled. She still hadn't convinced Samuel to stop calling her mom, but she didn't mind as much anymore. "I've been thinking about doing more. Expanding the work we've started. There's so much more we can do to help people." Samuel nodded, his eyes still on the road, but Grace could tell he was listening intently. "You've already done a lot of good, Grace. More than most people with your kind of resources ever think to do." Grace shook her head. "It's not enough. I've been so blind to the struggles people face, the real struggles. I can't just sit back and go back to the way things were. I want to keep pushing forward, making a difference where it matters." There was a brief silence before Samuel spoke again. "You're doing something that most people never do. You're seeing the world for what it really is. And that's what makes all the difference." Grace felt a warmth in her chest at his words. Samuel had always had a way of cutting to the heart of things, of speaking truth without judgment. She valued that more than anything. Later that evening, Grace sat in her penthouse, looking over some plans for a new community center she had been helping to fund. The glow of the city lights filled the room, but instead of feeling disconnected from the world, as she had so many times before, she felt part of it. She was no longer an observer, living behind the walls of wealth and privilege. She was engaged, involved, and committed to making real, lasting change. The phone buzzed on the table beside her, and when she picked it up, she saw it was a message from Sarah, a young woman she had met at the youth center. Sarah had grown up in a tough neighborhood, but she had dreams of becoming a teacher, and Grace had quietly been helping her with scholarships and mentorship. "Thank you, Grace. I wouldn't be where I am without you. You've given me hope." Grace smiled as she read the message. It was moments like these that made everything worthwhile. She had spent so many years chasing after superficial goals, but now she knew what real wealth felt like. It wasn't about the money or the power, it was about the people she could help, the lives she could touch. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Samuel, checking in to see if she needed anything before the next day's meetings. She responded with a simple, "Thank you, Samuel. See you tomorrow." As she set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her journey wasn't over, it never would be, but she was on the right path now. And as she looked out over the city she had once felt so detached from, she knew that her life had changed forever, in ways she could never have predicted. She had found true wealth not in the things she owned or the status she had once sought, but in the relationships she had built, the kindness she had shown, and the empathy she had learned to embrace. Grace Whitman was no longer the woman she had once been, and for the first time in her life, she was truly proud of who she had become. If you enjoyed Grace's journey and the story of personal transformation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We have more stories just like this about real change, empathy, and discovering what truly matters in life coming soon. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching. "That's cool, man. I'm glad to hear it." Blake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was progress. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to earn back some of the respect he had lost. As he walked to the park that afternoon, Blake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He wasn't perfect, he still had a long way to go, but he was on the right path. He had chosen to change, and that was what mattered. When he arrived at the park, Mr. Jenkins was waiting for him as always. The old man smiled as Blake approached, his eyes twinkling with approval. "You're looking more confident these days, Mr. Jenkins said as they began their training. Blake nodded, feeling the truth of that statement deep in his bones. "I feel more confident. It's different, but in a good way." "Mr. Jenkins chuckled. "That's because you're learning how to control your anger instead of letting it control you." "That's real strength, Blake." Blake smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He still had a lot to learn, but he was finally starting to believe in himself, and that was worth more than anything else. As Blake's confidence grew, so did the challenges that came with it. While his training with Mr. Jenkins was giving him the tools to control his emotions, there were still parts of his past that haunted him, especially his old friends. Nick, Josh, and Ryan had been noticeably absent from his life since their last confrontation, and Blake knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. One afternoon, as Blake was leaving school, he spotted Nick leaning against a car in the parking lot, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Josh and Ryan stood a few feet behind him, their postures tense. Blake's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was it, the final confrontation he had been dreading. Blake walked toward them, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, Nick pushed himself off the car and stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "So, this is who you are now," Nick said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some wannabe karate kid? You think you're better than us now?" Blake took a deep breath, reminding himself of Mr. Jenkins' teachings. This wasn't about fighting. It was about control. "It's not about being better," Blake said, his voice steady. "It's about being different. I don't want to be that guy anymore, Nick." The one who hurts people for no reason. Nick scoffed, shaking his head. Man, you've changed. And not in a good way. We used to run this school, Blake. Now look at you hanging out with that old man, apologizing to people like Marcus. What happened to you? Blake clenched his fists at his sides, but he didn't let the anger take over. He had come too far to fall back into his old habits. I'm trying to make things right, he said, his voice calm. I hurt a lot of people, Nick. I can't keep doing that. Josh stepped forward, his expression conflicted. Blake, we've been friends for years. You're just going to walk away from that. Blake sighed. He had thought about this moment for weeks, and while it hurt to lose the people he had once called friends, he knew it was necessary. I'm not walking away from anything, Blake said, but I'm not going back to the way things were. You guys can come with me, or you can stay stuck in the same place. It's your choice. Nick's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with anger. So that's it, huh? You think you're better than us now, and we're just supposed to sit here and take it? Blake shook his head. No, I'm not better than anyone. I'm just trying to be better than who I was. For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the air was thick, but Blake didn't waver. He stood his ground, refusing to back down. This was the ultimate test of everything he had learned, the moment where he would prove to himself that he had truly changed. Finally, Nick turned away, his shoulders stiff with frustration. Whatever, man. Do what you want. But don't come running back to us when this whole respect thing doesn't work out. Blake watched as Nick, Josh, and Ryan walked away, their footsteps echoing across the parking lot. He felt a pang of sadness. Losing them wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary for his growth. This was the final break from his past, the moment where he chose a new path for himself. As he stood there, watching them disappear from sight, Blake felt a strange sense of peace. It hurt to let go of his old life, but he knew it was the right decision. He wasn't the same person he had been, and he couldn't keep pretending that he was. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet reflection and personal growth. Blake continued his training with Mr. Jenkins, each session teaching him more about discipline, respect, and inner peace. The physical exercises were challenging, but it was the mental and emotional lessons that had the greatest impact on Blake. He was learning how to control his anger, how to let go of the resentment that had weighed him down for so long. One afternoon, as Blake and Mr. Jenkins were wrapping up their training session, the old man paused, wiping his forehead with a towel. You've come a long way, Blake, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. I can see the change in you. Blake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. I feel different, he admitted, but I know I still have a lot to learn. Mr. Jenkins nodded. We all do. Life's a journey, son. The important thing is that you're on the right path now. Blake thought about those words as he walked home that evening. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments where the old anger threatened to creep back in, but he was learning how to handle it. He was learning how to be a better person, not just for himself, but for those around him. The real test of his growth came one Friday afternoon when the school held an assembly in the gym. The event was to honor community leaders, and to Blake's surprise, Mr. Jenkins was one of the honorees. He had known the old man was respected in the community, but he hadn't realized just how much of an impact he had made over the years. As the principal introduced Mr. Jenkins, the gym erupted into applause. Blake watched from the back of the room, feeling a swell of pride for his mentor. This Mantha's quiet, unassuming man had spent his life teaching others about respect, discipline, and kindness. And now the entire community was recognizing him for it. Mr. Jenkins stepped up to the podium, his voice calm and steady as he accepted the award. I'm not one for long speeches, he said with a smile, but I will say this. We all have the power to change, to be better than we were yesterday. It's not an easy journey, but it's a worthwhile one.
And it starts with respect for yourself and for others.
Blake felt those words resonate deep within him. That was what his journey had been about all along, respect. It wasn't just about controlling his anger or apologizing for his past mistakes. It was about learning to respect himself and the people around him, regardless of who they were or where they came from. After the assembly, Blake waited outside the gym for Mr. Jenkins. When the old man finally emerged, Blake approached him with a wide smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Jenkins. You deserve it." Mr. Jenkins chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "I appreciate that, Blake. But the real congratulations should go to you. You've done the hard work, and I'm proud of you." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. Coming from Mr. Jenkins, those words meant everything. He had spent so long trying to prove himself to his friends, to his family, and even to himself. But now, for the first time, he felt like he didn't need to prove anything. He was proud of who he was becoming, and that was enough. "I couldn't have done it without you," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Jenkins placed a hand on Blake's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You've had it in you all along, Blake. You just needed someone to help you find it." As they walked away from the gym together, Blake felt a sense of closure settle over him. His journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more challenges to face, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had the tools, the discipline, and the respect to handle it. Later that evening, as Blake walked through the town square, he saw a group of kids playing basketball together, some white, some black, all laughing and joking without a care in the world. A few months ago, Blake would have sneered at the sight, maybe even joined in with his friends to make a cruel comment. But now, as he watched the kids play, he felt nothing but peace. Blake sat down on a nearby bench, watching the game unfold. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the court. For the first time in a long time, Blake felt truly at ease. He had let go of the anger, the hate, and the need to control everything around him. He had learned to respect himself and others, and that was what mattered most. As the kids continued their game, Blake closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't the same person he had been, he was better. And for the first time, he knew that he was on the right path, a path built on respect, discipline, and the quiet strength he had learned from Mr. Jenkins. With a peaceful smile, Blake opened his eyes and watched the sun dip below the horizon, ready for whatever the future held. 1 year after that fateful encounter with Mr. Jenkins, Blake's life had transformed in ways he never imagined. The once cocky, arrogant kid who bullied others for sport had become someone new, someone kinder, more thoughtful, and surprisingly respected by his peers. It wasn't that Blake had become perfect. There were still days when the old anger tried to creep back in, moments when he had to remind himself of everything Mr. Jenkins had taught him. But each time those feelings surfaced, Blake had the tools to manage them now. He knew that strength didn't come from lashing out or proving yourself through aggression. It came from controlling that instinct and making choices that reflected respect and empathy. At school, people saw Blake differently. The students who used to avoid him, who walked the other way when they saw him coming, now greeted him in the hallways. He had repaired his relationships with those he had wronged, like Marcus, and built new friendships with people he never would have considered talking to before. It wasn't easy, but each conversation, each step forward, helped him rebuild his reputation. Even his mother had noticed the change. Their relationship had grown stronger, more open. Blake had started talking to her about the things that weighed on him, about his frustrations, his fears, and the path he had chosen. She was proud of him, and that meant more to Blake than he could express. But there was still one person who hadn't seen the full extent of his transformation: his father. Blake's father had left years ago, abandoning the family without so much as a goodbye. The absence had shaped Blake's anger, fueling the rage that had driven so much of his destructive behavior. But now, a year into his journey of self-improvement, Blake realized he was ready to confront that part of his life. With his mother's encouragement, Blake tracked down his father, who had moved to a nearby city and was living a quiet, unremarkable life. Blake didn't know what he expected from the meeting closure, maybe, or just the chance to finally say everything he had been holding inside for so long. When the day came, Blake stood outside the modest apartment building where his father lived, his heart pounding in his chest. The anger he had felt for so many years was still there, but it was different now, more controlled, less consuming. He wasn't here to lash out. He was here to speak his truth. Blake knocked on the door, his hands trembling slightly. When his father answered, the shock on his face was immediate. He hadn't expected to see his son standing on his doorstep, especially not after so many years of silence. "Blake," his father said, his voice thick with disbelief. Blake nodded, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. "About everything." His father hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, allowing Blake to enter the small apartment. They sat at the kitchen table, an awkward silence hanging between them. Blake took a deep breath, summoning the courage to say what he had come to say. "You leaving it messed me up. For a long time, I didn't know how to deal with it. I was angry. At you, at Mom, at everything. And I hurt a lot of people because of it." His father's face fell, guilt and regret etched into every line. "Blake, I'm not here to blame you," Blake interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I just wanted you to know how it affected me. I spent so many years being angry, and I thought it was because of you. But I've learned that I don't have to carry that anger anymore. I don't have to let it define me." His father stared at him, a mixture of shock and admiration in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Blake. I didn't know, I didn't realize how much I hurt you." Blake nodded. "I know. But I'm not angry anymore. I've let it go. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay now." For the first time in years, Blake's father smiled a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've grown into someone I never could have imagined." Blake smiled back, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. He didn't need anything more from his father, not an apology, not an explanation. He had made peace with the past, and that was enough. As Blake left the apartment that day, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his father's abandonment was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and acceptance. He had taken control of his own life, and that was the most important thing. Blake's final step on his journey came a few months later, when Mr. Jenkins approached him with an offer that took him by surprise. "You've come a long way, Blake," Mr. Jenkins said one afternoon as they wrapped up a training session. "I think it's time for you to start teaching." Blake stared at him, stunned. "Teaching? You want me to teach karate?"
Mr.
Jenkins chuckled. "Not just karate. I want you to teach the lessons you've learned, the lessons about respect, discipline, and control. There are a lot of kids out there who could use someone like you, someone who understands what they're going through." Blake hesitated, unsure of whether he was ready for such a responsibility. "I don't know if I'm qualified for that." Mr. Jenkins smiled. "You're more qualified than you think. You've lived it, Blake. You've walked the path. And now it's your turn to help others find their way." Blake thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. It made sense. He had spent the past year rebuilding himself, learning how to control his anger and live a life of respect. Now, he had the chance to pass those lessons on to others, to help kids who were struggling the same way he had been. With Mr. Jenkins' guidance, Blake began working with a group of younger students at the community center. At first, it felt strange standing in front of a group, teaching the very lessons he had once been so resistant to. But as the weeks went on, Blake found that he enjoyed it. He liked seeing the kids grow, both physically and emotionally. He liked watching them learn how to channel their energy into something positive, something that made them stronger without tearing others down. One of the kids, a shy boy named Tyler, reminded Blake of himself when he was younger, angry, confused, and unsure of where to direct his emotions. Tyler had a lot of potential, but he was prone to outbursts, much like Blake had been. Blake worked with him closely, teaching him not just the physical aspects of karate, but the mental and emotional discipline that came with it. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Tyler approached Blake, his expression hesitant. "Blake," he asked quietly, "do you think I'll ever get better at controlling my temper? I feel like I'm always angry." Blake smiled, crouching down to meet Tyler's gaze. "I know it's hard," he said gently. "I used to be just like you, always angry, always looking for a way to let it out. But you can get better. It just takes time and practice." Tyler nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "You were really like me." Blake nodded. "Yeah, but I had someone who helped me, and now I want to help you." Tyler's face brightened a little, and for the first time, Blake saw a spark of hope in the boy's eyes. That was the moment Blake knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't just teaching karate, he was helping kids like Tyler find their own paths, helping them learn the same lessons that had changed his life. As Blake watched Tyler and the other kids practice their moves, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what Mr. Jenkins had been talking about all along, passing the torch, helping others find their way. And now Blake was part of that legacy. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, Blake felt like he had found his place in the world. He had found his purpose, and that was worth more than anything else. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and growth, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And let me know in the comments what part of Blake's journey resonated with you the most. I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next video.
I know this is unexpected, Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. But I love you, Olivia. I love the life we're building together, and I want to make it official. Will you marry me this time for real? Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she looked at the man in front of her, the man who had once been her enemy, but who had since become the love of her life. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, he'll marry you. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the lights of the city sparkled around them. This time their marriage wouldn't be based on a bet. It would be built on love, trust, and the promise of a future they would face together. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia stood together in front of a small group of family and friends, exchanging vows in a quiet, intimate ceremony. It was nothing like their first wedding. There were no business contracts, no hidden agendas, and no expectations of control or power. This time it was real. Olivia's mother was there, smiling proudly as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle. Ethan's family, too, had gathered to witness the moment, their support a reminder of how far he had come. As Ethan and Olivia stood before the officiant, their hands clasped together, they exchanged vows filled with love and sincerity. There was no need for grand declarations, just the quiet promise to stand by each other, no matter what the future held. I promise to love you, Ethan said, his voice steady, to respect you, and to be the man you deserve. For as long as we both live. Olivia smiled, her eyes shining with tears. And I promise to love you, Ethan, to trust you, and to build a life with you, one filled with love, forgiveness, and hope. As they kissed, the small group of friends and family erupted into applause, but for Ethan and Olivia, the world around them seemed to disappear. In that moment, they were the only two people who mattered. As the months passed, Ethan and Olivia settled into their new life together, their love growing stronger with each passing day. Olivia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as they prepared to welcome their child into the world, they found themselves filled with a sense of peace and fulfillment. Ethan continued his efforts to make amends for his past mistakes, but now he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to atone for his wrongs, he was trying to build a better future, not only for himself and Olivia, but for their growing family. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Olivia resting her head on Ethan's shoulder, she looked up at him with a contented smile. Who would have thought, she mused softly, that it would all start with a bet? Ethan chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. It's funny, isn't it, that something so ridiculous could lead to something so wonderful? Olivia nodded, her eyes twinkling with warmth. But I'm glad it did. Because now, we get to build this life together. And that's all I've ever wanted. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, Ethan knew that this life, this love was the best thing he had ever won. Not through manipulation, not through power, but through genuine love, hard-earned respect, and the promise of a future filled with hope. A few months later, Ethan and Olivia welcomed their baby girl into the world. As Ethan held their newborn daughter in his arms, tears filled his eyes. He had never imagined that his life could feel this complete, this meaningful. Olivia watched him, her heart full as she saw the joy in his eyes. They had come so far through pain, anger, and betrayal, but now they were a family. A real family. As Ethan looked down at their daughter, he smiled, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He had spent so long searching for power, for control, but now he realized that true strength came from love, from vulnerability, and from the willingness to change. "Welcome to the world, little one," Ethan whispered, his voice full of emotion. "You're going to have an amazing life." Olivia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they looked down at their daughter together. "She's perfect," Olivia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She is," Ethan agreed, his heart swelling with love. And as they sat together in the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The beginning of a life filled with love, forgiveness, and endless possibilities. They had started with a bet, but now they had built something real, something that would last forever. What do you think? Do you believe in second chances, or is some damage too deep to repair? We'd love to hear your thoughts on Ethan and Olivia's journey in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more inspiring tales of love, redemption, and hope. Thanks for watching.
And as long as he stayed true to his values, he knew he was on the right path. The night stretched on, full of promise and potential. And as Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. As Ethan gazed out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel excited for the future, for the challenges, the victories, and the continued fight for a world where everyone, no matter who they were, could rise to their full potential. This was his legacy, and it was just the beginning. If you've enjoyed this story of Ethan's journey toward leadership and change, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below together. We can keep the conversation about diversity and inclusion going. "I was thinking about it too," James said, his voice quiet but reflective. "It feels like so much has happened. But at the same time, it's hard to believe how far we've come." Mildred nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when this town could change like this. For so long it felt like we were stuck. But you showed us something different. You showed us that we could be better." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't do it alone, Mildred. It's been all of us. People like you, Rachel, Emily, Tommy even." Mildred chuckled softly. "Maybe. But we all needed someone to remind us what we were capable of." "That's what you did, James." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the sunset over the park. It was a quiet, reflective moment, one that reminded James of why he had stayed, why he had chosen to fight for this town. "It's not over," James said, more to himself than to Mildred. "There's still work to be done." "There's always more to be done," Mildred replied with a knowing smile. "But you've given this town something it didn't have before, hope." Meanwhile, Emily Green had been working on her biggest story yet. The pieces she had written for the local paper had caught the attention of a national magazine, and they had commissioned her to write a long-form feature about the transformation of Hollow Creek. She had spent months interviewing people: James, Tommy, Rachel, Sheriff Nate Johnson, and countless others. She poured her heart into the article, determined to capture the essence of what had happened in this small town. It wasn't just a story about racism or a fight for equality. It was about community, about resilience, about the power of one person's actions to ignite change. When the feature was published, it was an instant success. Readers from across the country were moved by the story of Hollow Creek, and Emily was flooded with messages of support. People wanted to know more. How had the town done it? How could they replicate that success in their own communities? For Emily, it was a deeply personal victory. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, and for a long time, she hadn't believed that the town could change. But now, as she read the responses to her article, she knew that anything was possible. The next spring, the first integrated class graduated from Hollow Creek High School. It was a historic moment, not just for the students, but for the entire town. The graduation ceremony was held in the town square, and the entire community showed up to celebrate. James was there, sitting in the front row with Mildred, Tommy, and Rachel, all of them beaming with pride. Lily Sanders, Mildred's granddaughter, gave the valedictory speech, speaking eloquently about the future, about unity, and about the lessons they had learned from the town's struggles. "We are the generation that will carry this town forward," Lily said, her voice clear and strong, "and we will do it together. Because we've learned that we are stronger when we stand as one." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the graduates tossed their caps into the air, there was a sense of triumph, of new beginnings. Hollow Creek had come so far, and now a new generation was ready to take the reins. As the town continued to grow and change, Harold Brooks made a surprising announcement. He was bringing back the name Rose's Diner. But this time, the name would reflect something different. Harold stood outside the diner, addressing a small crowd of onlookers. James, Mildred, and the rest of the diner's regulars were there, curious about the announcement. "Rose's Diner was named after my mother," Harold began, his voice filled with emotion. "She was a kind woman, a woman who believed in treating everyone with respect. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. We let this place become a symbol of division." Harold paused, glancing at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "But now I want to reclaim that name," Harold continued. "This diner is going to stand for something new, something my mother would be proud of. It's going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone has a seat at the table." The crowd cheered, and as the new sign for Rose's Diner was unveiled, it felt like a fitting tribute to the town's journey. As summer approached, Rachel Morales prepared to leave Hollow Creek once again, this time for good. Her work had taken her to other towns and cities, and while she had grown deeply attached to Hollow Creek, she knew it was time to move on. On her last night in town, she gathered with James, Emily, and the others at Rose's Diner for one final meal. The atmosphere was warm and nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared memories. "I'm going to miss this place," Rachel admitted as she sipped her coffee. "But I know you all are going to keep the momentum going." "Well, miss you too, Rachel," James said, smiling warmly. "But don't worry, we've got this." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about the town's journey, about how far they had come, and about the road that still lay ahead. When it was time to say goodbye, there were hugs, tears, and promises to keep in touch. But as Rachel drove away from Hollow Creek the next morning, she left knowing that the town was in good hands. Several months after Rachel's departure, James received a letter from her. He sat on his porch, the autumn air crisp and cool, as he read her words. "Dear James, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about Hollow Creek a lot lately, and I wanted to check in. I've been working with a community out west, and it reminds me so much of where Hollow Creek was when I first arrived. But seeing the progress we made gives me hope that change is possible, no matter where you are. I just wanted to thank you once again for everything you've done for the town and for me. You've taught me so much about patience, about perseverance, and about how change really happens. You'll never forget our time together. Take care of yourself, James, and take care of Hollow Creek. With gratitude, Rachel." James smiled as he folded the letter, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel's words were a reminder that their work was far from over, but it was also a reminder of how much they had already accomplished. Over time, Tommy Barnes fully embraced his role as a leader in the town's new direction. He became a regular volunteer at the community center, working with young people who, like him, had once been resistant to change. One afternoon, as Tommy sat on a bench outside the center, talking with a group of teenagers, he realized just how far he had come. The anger and fear that had once controlled him were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. "I used to think change was something to be afraid of," Tommy told the teens. "But now I see it's what makes us better. We can't grow if we don't open ourselves up to new ways of thinking." The teens listened intently, nodding in agreement. Tommy's journey had become an inspiration to many, showing that it was never too late to change. 1 year after the March for Unity, the town of Hollow Creek came together once again to celebrate. The town square was filled with music, food, and laughter, as people from all walks of life gathered to reflect on the progress they had made. James stood with Sheriff Nate Johnson, Emily Green, and Lily Sanders, watching the festivities with a deep sense of pride. The town was thriving, its people united by a shared vision of a better future. As the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the square, James felt a quiet sense of contentment. Hollow Creek had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more united than ever. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek continued to evolve. The town's story became a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with their own divisions. People came from far and wide to visit Rose's Diner, to see the mural painted by the teenagers, and to meet the people who had made change possible. But for James, it wasn't about the recognition. It wasn't about being a hero or a leader. It was about the quiet, steady work of building a community where everyone had a place. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle above the town, James felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be more work to do. But for now, in this moment, he was content. Hollow Creek was his home, and it was a home worth fighting for. As the story of James and Hollow Creek shows, change takes courage, community, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. If you've been inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the importance of unity, justice, and hope. And remember, your voice matters. Let us know in the comments how this story touched you and what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free. Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors' sons, strangers, had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker, And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours. Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith. Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough. You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel, Edith said gently. I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward. We are, Rachel agreed, her voice steady. We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay. Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing. Thank you, Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place. I'd love that, Edith replied without hesitation. I can't wait to see how far you've come. After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She, too, had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. Edith, you made it. Of course I did, Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. I wouldn't miss this for the world. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. Look who's here, Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. Grandma Edith, they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you. We missed you, Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. Can you stay for dinner? I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner, Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. They're doing so well, Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them. You should be proud of yourself too, Edith said gently. You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything. Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life. As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. I never thought I'd feel free, Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights, and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.